Thanks for coming. And this is my third time doing these Sea to Shore lectures. So the park keeps asking me back. So I'm pretty encouraged by that. And I really love giving these because, you know, there's a lot of great research that goes on the islands, and they are a gem in the national park system. And the more people we can tell about the great stories that come off these islands and the exciting things that we can learn from these islands, the better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my most recent project on the islands. And before I get started, I've got all these seals up here. And what I'm trying to indicate is that this project is a massive undertaking. It's the largest of its kind on the Pacific coast of North America. And because of that, there are a number of really excellent scholars that are involved. I certainly, you know, I'm the PI on this project, but largely that means I do a lot of the paperwork. And I have a lot of great scholars that we're collaborating with in agencies that do tremendous work. And I'm going to put their names up on the end, but much of this is not me. Many of these ideas are from the collaboration of many, many people. So let's get started here. But you'll have to forgive me. This is a slide about something that has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today. I have a new book that I'm going to try to peddle on you. There's flyers in the back. This was mentioned, Shellfish for the Celestial. We had a little title change there at the midnight hour. Celestial Empire. It is the culmination of a decade of work on the Channel Islands about the rise of commercial fisheries and the advent of the commercial fisheries that were started by immigrant Chinese populations that came over in the mid-19th century as part of the gold rush. And it's written for a general audience, and you can pre-order a copy on Amazon or go to the University of Utah Press. This will be partly a charitable donation. I just had my first child 3.5 weeks ago. And so every book that you buy gets me a half a cup of coffee, which makes me a better parent. So go ahead and order one. All right, so let's get started here. And since the season of schools are starting back up again, and we're starting up again at the university, I thought we'd start with a quiz to see how much you know and test your knowledge here. So here it is. Who were the first Americans? A, were they Clovis people? B, Clovis ancestors from Siberia? C, Clovis ancestors from Europe? D, people unrelated to Clovis? Or E, none of the above? Anyone want to take a gander? I heard D, people unrelated to Clovis. Okay, anybody else? E, none of the above? You all fail. All right. The answer is F, we just don't know. All right. Sorry. So I'm going to give you the end of this talk right at the beginning. And the end is we still don't know. We still don't know. So this is a project, one of the goals of this project is to start to get to answer this question or come close to answering this question or really take a step down the road towards investigating this question of who the first Americans were. But the short answer is we still don't know, and we have a long way to go before we get there. All right, so but despite that, we've known, we've discovered in the last several decades, and many archaeologists and scientists have come to agree and come to a consensus on the migrations of anatomically modern humans around the globe, when and how they colonized different continental landscapes, at what times, by what routes. And so most archaeologists, most anthropologists now agree that the the homeland, the origins of anatomically modern humans were in Africa, and we have this spread around the globe in a stepwise fashion in these migrations to different continental landscapes. And the last of these migrations, in terms of continental migrations and colonizations, was into North and South America. But when that occurred, who made those migrations, what routes they took, we still just don't know, and we have a lot more questions than we have answers. And so what I want to do to start is sort of take you through the story of how we thought we knew and how we've gotten to know less than what we knew 20 years ago, all right? And, as we go through this story, it's not because archaeologists were blind or we were railroaded or we weren't looking in the right places. This is the process of science working. We came up with theories that seemed to fit the data, and then the data changed and led us in a new direction, and that's where we are now. All right, so let's begin in the 19th century and sort of the first questions about the origins of Native Americans and when and how they first colonized the New World. And for most scientists, claims for the deep antiquity of the colonization of the New World have long been met with skepticism. Right? So when Europeans first arrived, and the leading scholars of the day in the 19th and early 20th century, most believed that Native Americans reached the New World, particularly North America, in the last 4,000 years. And we can spend a whole class or a whole lecture on this. There's a lot of reasons for this, but this was called the short chronology. And this time frame was much too short to allow for much change or variation, and ultimately it was part of a colonialist ethic that it's much easier to undermine Native American history, claims to land, if they haven't been there very long, right? And some sort of misconceptions about who Native Americans are and were. And so this led to this short chronology. Well, this myth was shattered in 1924 with the finding of one site. And this is the Folsom site, New Mexico. And what you're looking at is a bison antiguus rib. This is an extinct form of bison with a clear human-made tool, projectile point, embedded into those ribs, right? So this was discovered in 1924, and it showed unequivocally that humans and these now extinct animals that scientists knew went extinct at the end of the Ice Age, at least 10,000 years ago, were in North America at the same time, right? So the chronology, basically with one discovery, gets pushed back 6,000 years, right? This is before the advent of what we call chronometric dating techniques, things like radiocarbon dating techniques, techniques that can tell us about what time this site was occupied. So this was before this. So they're using, we don't know if folks didn't know if it was 10,000 or 15,000 years ago that this site was formed, but in fact that this was at least 10,000 years ago because these animals went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. So following this, a number of other sites started to pop up. So once that sort of scientists have, their eyes are open to the possibility, they start to find more and more sites. And so a growing list of human-made tools associated with Pleistocene megafauna, now extinct Ice Age animals, started to show up. And many of these were associated with mammoth remains. So places like Murray Springs and a number of other sites where you have clear association with human-made tools and now extinct Pleistocene animals. And at one site, again in New Mexico, near Clovis, New Mexico, these really distinctive projectile point technologies were often found associated with mammoths. So these became known as Clovis points, right? And they're these large bifacially flaked projectile points with a really distinctive what we call flute at the base. The last thing you do is sort of make a thinning flake on both sides running horizontal to the tip, right? And what do you think that's used for? Yeah, right, so to thin it down so you can more easily lash it to a point, right? Or a shaft or a spear. And these then became the tools for hunting Pleistocene megafauna. Right, and so all these sites started to pop up, and scientists started to date these sites, document these sites around continental North America, and everything seemed to fit the data where what we call Clovis people migrated across a Bering land bridge because of submerged, or because of lowered sea levels during the last glacial maximum. They moved from Siberia into Alaska, waited in Alaska until an ice-free corridor opened, and then migrated down into continental North America, hunting mammoths and mastodons and extinct bison antiguus, all these megafauna of North America, and this all seemed to fit the data, right? Clovis were the first cultures into the New World. They were adapted for hunting these now extinct megafauna, and they swept from shore to shore with this deadly hunting technology. So what is Clovis? Clovis is this Paleo-Indian technology. The type site is at Blackwater Draw near Clovis, New Mexico. It's the oldest of a series of those fluted points, these flutes, right? And it occurs over a relatively restricted time period from about 13,500 years ago to 12,900 years ago. So all these sites were being found. Radiocarbon dating was invented in the 50s, and sites were dated, and they always, if they had these Clovis points, dated into this really tight chronological time frame, right? And so this was a megafauna hunting adaptation for mammoths, extinct bison, and the Paleo-Indian period then ends when these critters go extinct and new adaptations follow from that, right? And it all seemed to work. It all seemed to fit. This was the colonization of the New World. Do you remember this from grade school, from high school perhaps? Do you remember getting taught this story? Some of you must, right? Yeah? All right. So again, Clovis culture, 13.5 to 12.9 before present. Clovis points spreading down an ice-free corridor across the Bering land bridge, this migration into the New World. It all seemed to work. And we talk about Clovis points a lot. I want to make clear that Clovis points are very distinctive. They tell us that that site is going to date between 13.5 and 12.9. But the Clovis toolkit was much more than Clovis points, these fluted Clovis points. So here's sort of a typical Paleo-Indian toolkit of knives and scrapers and bone points and other sort of technologies of the Clovis and Paleo-Indian peoples. So despite the fact that there were some sort of archaeologists on the margin saying maybe this is not the way the New World was colonized, maybe there are problems with this model. Most archaeologists accepted it, but problems started to pop up. People started to question this idea. So this Clovis first model of New World colonization started to be called into question by a number of scholars. And one is, well, what did this ice-free corridor look like? This ice-free corridor opens up, people quickly migrate down into the New World. What did that ice-free corridor look like? Was it this fertile paradise filled with megafauna that people were following and hunting along the way? Or if you've ever been to Alaska or a recently deglaciated landscape, Would it have looked more like this? Scraped clean of resources for megafauna and for human subsistence. So what did that ice-free corridor look like? When was it viable? Right? When would it have been viable for people to migrate down? And then more data started to come out, such as this. This is all the fluted points. Well, this gets a little complicated, but these are distributions of Clovis points and Clovis variants, things that may be Clovis points, maybe they're later Paleo-Indian fluted points, but regardless, this is sort of a distribution of what we can call Clovis or closely related points across North America. What do you see there about that distribution? Do like a little interaction thing. They're mostly on the East Coast. They cluster on the East Coast, right? So some archaeologists started to question, well, if they're coming down an ice-free corridor, if Clovis is migrating into the New World, into the heartland of North America, shouldn't we see the most Clovis points in this region and then less as we go to the coast? So does this distribution cause us problems? Well, others would argue, well, you know, there's more people living on the East Coast. There's more farmland. People are picking these things up. You know, maybe it's just a visibility issue, right? Rather than something, this is an artifact of the data rather than some real pattern. John Erlandson just told me that a new paper came out today while I was driving up and didn't get to see it. So, the ice-free corridor opened right around 15,000 years ago, and a new paper in Nature confirmed that about 14.7, 14.6. So right around that 15,000 years ago, the ice-free corridor opened. This new paper suggests that the ice-free corridor was more this barren landscape until at least 12.6. So if it's barren until 12.6, that's not enough time for Clovis to migrate down into the heartland of the New World. And then plus, if we look at the dating of Clovis sites, the oldest Clovis sites are in continental North America. Clovis sites in the corridor are younger, suggesting Clovis may have backwashed up. So they migrated perhaps the other way. Right? Again, it's not the nail in the Clovis coffin, but it raises some eyebrows, right? Oh, maybe it is. This idea that Clovis were these deadly big game hunters may be exaggerated as well, and there's lots of debates in the literature over this. But essentially, we have a couple handfuls of clear associations of Clovis points with megafaunal kills. And in fact, more and more research has come out to show that Clovis and Clovis people were more generalized foragers than they were deadly big game assassins. Right? So again, questioning this model, this Clovis first model, there's very little archaeological evidence for big game hunting. Well, in my mind, the nail in the coffin came with this, and this is this is the site of Monte Verde in Chile. In fact, it's at the nearly the southern tip of Chile, all the way down here in South America. Tom Dillahay has worked at this site since the 1970s. And by the 90s, he had published his magnum opus about this site, this massive 2-volume set. And there had been other sites in the New World that archaeologists had claimed were older than 13.5. And if you dared suggest that, what would happen is this group of people, this very scary group of people right here, who became known as the Clovis Mafia, these folks would descend, not literally, but in the literature, and sort of pick apart your site and your claims for a pre-Clovis occupation in the New World. They became known as the Clovis Mafia. They were the gatekeepers of Clovis. Many of these folks wrote dissertations and got tenure and promotion and the accolades of academia based on this Clovis first model. And they defended that model. As we do as scientists, we critically analyze each other's work. And so Dillehay did something really smart. He worked at this site. He dated the site to 14,500 years ago, 1,000 years before Clovis, all the way down at the southern tip of Chile, before the ice-free corridor was viable and perhaps maybe even open. And he had all this great technology. These are tent stakes with hides still attached to them. This isn't a site that's on the coast, but it's near the coast. But he published this magnum opus about it, and then he invited the mafia down, right? He got money to fly the mafia down. He had them, the excavations, there are all these things with it, but the excavations were done, they were covered up, but he showed them all the artifacts. He showed them here they are looking at the stratigraphy, right? And he showed them, laid out the case for them. And to a person, they agreed that Monte Verde is real. It dates to 1405. Clovis is dead. Well, Clovis is not dead. It's still real, but the Clovis first model of New World colonization is now on its ear, right? So decades of work to explain when and how people first arrived into the New World has been thrown away in a day, I guess. Not quite that dramatic. So this is mid-90s, right, John? Mid-90s, probably. I don't know to the year, but mid-90s, probably. I think his yeah, something like that, yeah. And so we've now had 15, 20 years of the Clovis first model disputed and no agreement how and when people first arrived. I should add that while the Clovis Mafia here all agreed it was real, once they got home, at least one dissenting voice started to rear up. So these things it's sort of a soap opera in archaeology to a bit. So there's lots I could tell you about Monte Verde, but it's this incredible excavation, house foundations, a medicine man hut, all this perishable material because it was in these special preservation conditions, or still like cuds that people were chewing and spit on the ground. I mean, it's just like incredible. And also preserved seaweed and kelp, 8 different types. So while this site was not on the coast, and in fact, when it was occupied, it was even farther away from the coast than it is today, and we'll get to that in a second, there's this mix of sort of terrestrial foraging and hunting and foraging on the coast. So this mix of sort of adaptations, and of course, no Clovis points, no fluted technology. Again, 1,000 years before Clovis. So this sort of opened Pandora's box, right? And I could tell you about a lot of other ideas, but since the person who really came up with the leading idea is sitting in the front row today, the kelp highway hypothesis was proposed by John Erlandson and a couple ecologists. And what they noticed was, and what they argued was, well, the ice-free corridor is not open. The most likely and viable route into the New World was probably along the Pacific coast. And this has to do with a lot of genetic information, a lot of archaeology, but also a lot of ecological information, that the same species of kelp, the same types of resources like shellfish and sea mammals were available from the Old World circumnavigating the North Pacific. It's a little break in that kelp replaced by mangrove, really productive mangrove environments. Then it picks right back up again to South America. And so John gave it this snappy name, which which really helps, right? This kelp highway that really helped people sort of think about, well, if you imagine trying to walk from Alaska down to South America as a hunter-gatherer, right? It's a tough road to go down. Mountains, deserts you'll have to cross, different resources, patches that you'll have to learn to adapt to. That's a really difficult migration where, not that this wouldn't have been difficult, but at least it's the same sort of adaptations all around the North Pacific that may have facilitated human migration into the New World. Of course, the problem with this, and John will be the first to admit, there's absolutely no hard archaeological evidence to support this, right? In that, if for the hard archaeological evidence, we say, where are the sites on the coast that predate Clovis, right? And if we look around the coast in the New World, there are no sites that predate Clovis that are on the coast or on islands off the coast, right? So where is the archaeological support for this? Well, I tell my students often that most questions can be answered with squiggly lines, all right? So, and I tell you the same thing. And this is a climatic record of temperature through the last 400,000 years. Of course, this includes the Ice Age epoch of the Pleistocene, right? And if we look at these squiggly lines, what you see is through periods, we've had this massive fluctuation in global temperatures through time, through cold and warm periods, right? And we are here in a interglacial period, a period of warming temperatures. This migration into the New World, if it was pre-Clovis, happened during this interval at some point, during a really cold period when sea levels would have been much lower, right? Because what happens during glacial periods is ice builds up at polar caps and high altitude regions, and that ice is formed by sucking out the water from the oceans and depositing it as snow, as ice in these polar caps and high altitude regions. So sea levels then lower. So perhaps the evidence, the archaeological support for a pre-Clovis migration, a kelp highway migration, is submerged by rising post-glacial sea levels. Also, you all live on the coast or near the coast here. You know about these coastal dynamics, coastal erosion, coastal landscape change, that these sites on the coast are subject to all sorts of coastal erosion. And so many of these sites might not only be submerged by rising sea levels, but subject to this dynamic nature of coastal environments. Here's a picture of those maximum ice sheets to show you what we're talking about in terms of how much water is sucked out of the oceans, right, and these sea levels lower. Now, to give you an idea of how dramatically sea level has been lowered or was lowered during the Pleistocene epoch, is here's San Francisco. There's a nice map of San Francisco. Here are the Farallon Islands. Up to about 12,000 years ago, well after Clovis, you could walk from downtown San Francisco to the Farallon Islands. Right? So the really dynamic environment. So on average, since the last glacial maximum, 18,000 years ago or so, we're talking about 120 meters of sea level change, right? So this is a really dynamic environment. And so the evidence might in fact be underwater. Perfect, we don't have to look, right? Done, it's underwater, just trust us, it's there. No, we don't do that. So, and in fact, the modern geography of coastal environments, sea level rise didn't start to stabilize. It continues to rise, and we can get into the politics of that. It's not the time nor the place for it. But sea levels stabilized right around 7,000 years ago. Right? And there were periods where sea levels would rise quickly and then more slowly, and then quickly and slowly. So this is not sort of a, you know, a constant rate of sea level rise over the last 18, 20,000 years. This is a dynamic sort of state here, ecological state. All right, so the good news is that all is not lost, right? There are examples, not many, but there are examples of archaeologists finding and working on sites that are submerged sites. There are very few examples of archaeologists working on submerged sites that predate Clovis in North America. One that has come out recently and is really exciting. This is a site in Florida in the middle of a river that dates to 14,500 years old. It is pre-Clovis. All these really cool stone tools, these excavations that are occurring with scuba gear, underwater, mastodon bones butchered by humans, really exceptional stuff. Very different than finding a site perhaps under a coastal environment, submerged on the coast, but still can show us that the possibility for finding sites that are now submerged, and pre-Clovis sites in particular, exists. So one of the things that we're doing here, this project, now I get to the project. So that's sort of the background and one of the really interesting research questions that we're pursuing. But the reason to pursue it on the Channel Islands is this. Work by particularly John and a number of other folks have found and dated and studied the highest density of early sites found anywhere in the New World coast. So the Channel Islands, the northern Channel Islands alone, contain 83, we're at 83 right now, sites that date older than 8,000 years. Right? Look at that, 8,000 or 83 sites that date older than 8,000 years. Now to put that in some perspective, this is what sea levels look like 10,500 years ago. So many of these sites, when they were occupied, are better understood as inland sites. They're not coastal sites. They weren't on the coast, right? In many cases, they were 2, 3, 5 kilometers from the coastline at the time they were occupied. And so there's been a lot of work on the Channel Islands to find these early sites, find these early terrestrial sites on the island, date them, study them, better understand them, but they are not coastal sites. Think about all those potential sites. If these are people adapted to coastal environments, going after shellfish and fish and sea mammals, they would have probably made camps along the contemporary coastline. And so rising post-glacial sea levels probably, almost certainly, submerged a vast archaeological landscape that is invisible to us at the moment. You all know about Arlington Springs, right? One of the more famous sites on the Channel Islands. This is the oldest site on the Channel Islands, 13,000-year-old human remains, first excavated by Phil Orr in 1959, now dated by John Johnson to 13,000 years ago. So we know that people were on the Channel Islands at least 13,000 years ago, all the way up to historic contact. And we have all these early sites. Here's the modern geography of the islands. All of these early sites, despite the fact that we have lost 75% of the islands as they looked 18, 20,000 years ago. So 75% of the northern Channel Islands are now underwater. Right, so what are we missing archaeologically, potentially, because of that? So The project that we're involved in now is the first sort of systematic effort to better understand these submerged landscapes of the Pacific coast. We probably know more about the surface of the moon. Hope no astronauts are in here. Maybe they'll argue with me. We probably know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the seafloor of the Pacific Ocean. We've done very little to scientifically map and understand the submerged landscapes of the Pacific coast. And so we have this ongoing project that we've started just this summer to start to get at, well, are there archaeological sites on these now submerged paleo landforms? And so what we do, and what we have a couple different facets of this project, and one is just to continue to do what we've been doing, surveys and work on the terrestrial environment on the Channel Islands to look for early sites. So there's certain distinctive technologies. These are Channel Island barb points. These are crescents that tell us they were very old sites. So just like Clovis points tell you that these sites are between 13.5 and 12.9. And Clovis is still real. It was a real archaeological horizon. It just wasn't the first in the New World. And so just like that, just like we use Clovis points to identify and date Clovis sites, we can date archaeological sites on the Channel Islands based on their technologies in many cases. We also are involved in a systematic radiocarbon dating of shell middens across the island to try to find these early sites. And why would we do that? Well, one reason is if we're going to understand, if we're going to look for a needle in the haystack and look underwater for sites, let's use the terrestrial archaeology as a roadmap to what may be underwater. If we can understand these early adaptations, where people located themselves, why they moved into the interior of the islands, perhaps we can follow those sites down to the coastline and underwater to look for sites that are now submerged, early sites that are now submerged. And so this project is funded by BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and it's part of a cooperative agreement in that this is not a research project, right? We're certainly asking research questions like when did the first people arrive? What do submerged archaeological sites, where are they located? What do they look like? What were the adaptations? But for BOEM, this is about management. If people arrived in the New World, let's just say, we don't even know when they arrived, but let's say they arrived 15,000 years ago. Get my math right. That's 8,000 years of coastal occupations that are now submerged by rising sea levels. Just like we protect archaeological sites that we see in the terrestrial environment on the Channel Islands or on the mainland, we need to protect those archaeological sites that are now underwater. So for BOEM, this is about managing and protecting those sites that we can't even see. All right, so we don't want to understand just about when did people first arrive, but where are there archaeological sites that are underwater? Where are they? Can we predict where those might be? And in doing so, can we avoid damaging those sites into the future? So we're conducting those terrestrial surveys, and here are these little yellow marks here are clusters of early sites on the Channel Islands. Sort of a cluster analysis, and where it's red, there's lots of them. Where it's yellow, there's a high density of them. And again, this can tell us about a roadmap of underwater. And then we can also, by understanding how people settle on the landscape, what resources they need, where they would locate themselves, we could start to map where those people might have settled on the underwater landscape. So for example, we know that people located themselves near fresh water on the Channel Islands, reliable fresh water and the largest drainages. And we can map those drainages offshore. Where did they go offshore? And by doing that, we can set up, and we're building this predictive model of where are the high probability landforms that are underwater that may contain archaeological sites. So what we do is we build this predictive model. We put in all our, like any model, it depends on what factors you weight and how you weight them, right? Is fresh water the most important? Are kelp forests the most important? Is flat land, or what is it that makes people want to settle in certain locations? And so we build this model and we start tweaking it and start to build this prediction of where people may have settled these now submerged landforms. So in green, that's sort of a low probability. Yellow is medium probability, and red is high probability. And again, based on what we know about the terrestrial archaeology, based on what we can model about the underwater landscape, based on all the data that we have of all the work that's been done thus far to map the submerged landscapes of the Channel Islands. And so we build this model, and what we've done is in early June, we started our first work to test this predictive model, or get more high resolution data of these submerged landscapes. So we built in, we identified 4 places based on this model where people might have settled as they were migrating down the Kelp Highway and reached the Channel Islands. And so here are those 4 locations that we've been looking at. And just to give you an example of this work, this modeling work that we've done, this is the spot in between Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz. At one time, it had this massive bay and probably estuary in between this area. There are a series of early archaeological sites that ring eastern Santa Rosa, western Santa Cruz, massive drainages that would have drained into what John has called Crescent Bay because of these chipstone crescents, these early technologies. And this may have been a hot spot for people to settle if they were going after these coastal resources, estuarine resources that would have been highly productive. Fresh water would have been available, and all the sort of things that we think would attract people were available in this area. Santa Rosa, another one, again, a cluster of early sites. Arlington, man, I think he's a man now, right? He's gone man, woman, man, based on some analysis of the Arlington remains. But he's a man now, and there's this cluster of sites here in Arlington. And again, the sort of recipe of resources that might have been attractive for early migrants subsisting off of coastal resources, maritime resources, as they moved into the New World. All right, so how we do this survey, how we map these underwater landscapes, we use high resolution mapping, this chirp system. And I had a really nice video but due to some technical issues, it's not quite, it's not gonna work. But what it does is sends a pulse down, penetrates, tells us about the topography of the underwater landscape. Oops. Tells us about the topography, so what it looks like, so sort of the modern underwater landscape and what it looks like, and then penetrates and does a sub-bottom profile. So looks at the stratigraphy underneath, and it can produce things like this. Look at the surface of the seafloor and the sediments that are intact underneath that seafloor. And we can see what those things look like. All right, so why would we do this? So this is that first trip here. Here's collecting data. Here's that chirp system. sub-bottom and sonar profiling. Here's the crew going to work on that in early June. Here's this one of the locations that we did this in, again, in Crescent Bay here, in between Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz. And what did they come up with? This. Oh man, that's wildly uninteresting, right? Until you have someone who knows what they're looking for, which is generally not me, it's a geologist, right, who knows what they're looking for and can interpret this stuff. And so what the geologist tells us is this is actually really interesting. So one of the things that this is from that spot in between, this is just sort of one image of hundreds of images that we have. And here are some features, right? So this is the seafloor. This is what we call the transgressive surface. And the transgressive surface basically is a surface that forms from sea level rise, right? And the scouring out based on shoreline rise, sea level rise, and that's that surface that forms, right? Above it are all the more recent marine deposits, right? Sitting above it. And then this here looks like a paleo channel, right? Mapping one of those channels that we predicted would be there based on onshore river, onshore modern riverine channels, right? Extending those out into the ocean, right? And sitting right on top of those are what our geologist is calling high amplitude reflectors, right? That goes into my brain, and this could be a lot of things, right? It could be wildly uninteresting, but it also could be a shell midden. There's a possibility that that's a shell midden sitting right at the levee of that paleo channel, where we often find shell middens on the islands today, right near the best fresh water, right at the top where people locate themselves. And so it's going to take a lot. Sonar and the sub-bottom profiling is not going to tell us if there are archaeological sites there, but it can tell us about the paleogeography. It can, we can predict, or we can analyze what we see, and then we're going to have to go ground truth that. So I'll get to how we do that. Let me show you a couple other things. So this here's an image from a line right next to Crescent Bay, or right on the margins of Crescent Bay. Here's another one, again, wildly uninteresting until the geologist tells you what you're looking at. Transgressive surface, a sea level rise. There's the transparent marine Holocene sediments that have built up since sea level rose. But right here, this sort of fuzzy stuff right here, that may be estuarine, preserved estuarine sediments. Right? So even being able to sort of model where estuarine sediments may once have been, finding and ground truthing that would be a real leap forward in better understanding these submerged paleo environments. This sort of, these lines and this sort of squiggly stuff here, this is all strata that have been dipped and folded from tectonic activity and such, right? So we can sort of start to read these images and sort of predict what they might be. And then the last one here that I'll show you that I mean, again, there are hundreds of these, and we're going through and analyzing all this data. This is, I don't know that I've told you this, this is a multiple. This is basically an artifact of the data that when that chirp sends that signal down, it can get reflected up multiple times, and see how this kind of follows this surface right here and mirrors it. So it's an artifact of the data. It's not real. But here, what we see here, this may be gas. It may be an estuarine deposit. I'm not quite sure, but I want to take it. Oh, I have it labeled. So you know what I think that is. This sort of area here, this may be a paleo shoreline. Right, so think about the shorelines on the Channel Islands. Today, what you're seeing often in places that are really well preserved are marine terraces, old marine terraces, and then there's a steep drop off. That's that old wave cut platform. So this may be a preserved paleo shoreline, wave cut platform here, and this paleo shoreline that we may be seeing preserved. Again, we know that people were occupying these old paleo landforms based on our terrestrial surveys. This may be an excellent place to look for potential archaeological remains. Our second phase of, so we did these, that first pass in June was of these broad surveys to look in huge areas to see if we can see anything interesting. I've showed you a couple things that I think are interesting, and what we did 6 days ago, the trip just got finished, is then to go to those places that we think are interesting, that may have landforms or potential archaeological sites, and do some high resolution mapping. So rather than really broad areas over several kilometers, we went and did postage size sonar work, chirp work, and what's called multi-beam work to get the topography and of the seafloor and penetrate down again into those potentially preserved strata, 50 to 100 meters down, that sub-bottom work, and to do really fine scale, high resolution, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer postage stamp reconstructions or sonar work of the submerged landscape. I can't tell you what we found. I have no idea. The boat came in 6 days ago. We've got a lot of data to process. So in my defense, I told you I wasn't going to give you any answers today. So I'm sticking to it. I'm going to get you no closer to answering those questions I posed in the beginning. Not the Channel Islands, yeah, just an example of the multi-beam stuff. But I don't have any images yet of the Channel Islands. The good news is we hope to get some answers at some point. And so we are going to do some ground truthing of the interesting things that I've shown you, the hopefully even more interesting things that are going to come up from the recent work we did. And we're going to do a couple kinds of coring. It's called a box core, so a small, a wider, larger area core. They're still quite small, meter by a meter, less than a meter by a meter. And we're going to sample the seafloor. So the core is going to penetrate, obviously it's only about 4 inches in diameter, but it's going to penetrate deeply. And what we're going to see is, do we get estuarine deposits? Are these things that we thought they were? Do we potentially get archaeological sites like shell middens preserved in these? Are our predictions of what we think the submerged landscape looks like based on this chirp work, this sonar work, do they turn out to be true? So I wish I had more answers for you, but that's where we're at, and hopefully we'll have some more interesting data in the coming months, in the coming years. Ultimately, what we're going to do with this is the great thing about the Channel Islands is we have all this information about early sites, early settlements on the island. We're doing all this high resolution offshore work, and it's going to be the model for the entire Pacific coast. So what we learn here is going to tell us about where archaeological sites may be up and down the North American Pacific coast. So it potentially stands as the model for helping us understand the wider Pacific. And so it's supposed to be next summer. I think it's going to probably be 2 summers from now. We're going to take everything we've learned from the Channel Islands and all this work, and we're going to go up to Central Oregon, and we're going to replicate this and see if we've learned enough to be able to predict where these paleo landforms might be, where they might be preserved, and where they might contain archaeological sites that are preserved off the Oregon coast, potentially. So that's all I have for you. I'll take questions. I did want to show you that, I mean, this is just a small amount of the folks that are working on this project. I haven't included all the hard work that graduate students have done, and there are other partners. Again, we have a huge team, lots of supporters, and so thanks to all of them, and thanks to you, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Todd. This was a great talk. And we'll definitely have to make space for you for next year's lecture series and the lecture series after for even more answers. So
happy to do it.
I'd just like to remind you guys, we're open for questions now, but just wait for me to come to you with the microphone so that everyone can hear. So I'll make my way around here.
Hi, I had a question. Are you working with or sharing any information with Bob Ballard with the Nautilus program?
We have had some interaction with Bob and their crew, and they were doing some work very recently off the Channel Islands. I think they're in San Diego area now. And so part of our work is Bob is doing a lot of great work, and they do their own thing, and so we're collaborating as we can. But right now they're probably separate efforts, but we are talking and trying to coordinate things. He's doing a lot very quickly, so it can be hard to nail him down sometimes and get the collaboration going. Yeah, he was. Yeah, and they did some work, and we're looking forward to figuring out what they found and what they have to say. But they're working away, and
I think it would be fair to say that our team shared everything we were doing with them.
Yeah.
And offered to collaborate, and they told us they were not working above 200 meters in depth, and that what we were doing then was not a problem.
Yeah.
The next thing you do is work in the area we identified as the highest probability area and going up to 100 meters.
John can tell you this because he's much more senior than me, and so what John said. He said
we're hoping to cooperate.
Yeah.
Yeah, we volunteers that lead hikes on the islands. We have middens on virtually every hike, and our information, and even like Professor Glasgow, I think a recent finding, he has a midden there that's 9,500 years old. But in these middens, we're told that they're thousands of years old, that you find something at the top and you're going to go down, and you may end up going deep, deep, deep to thousands and thousands of years. Is this typical, and this is what you're looking for when you find these sites? That each and every one of these sites will be a variance of thousands of years in what you find there?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, certainly some sites represent thousands of years of human occupation, and people are going to the same landforms, and so you get deposits sort of built up one on top of the other, and there's great examples of that. But there are other sites that are single occupations that are 9,000 years old, and it's a single occupation, and either people didn't go and reoccupy that landform, or those later occupations were scoured out for some reason. They were eroded out, or one example might be that we have all these sea mammals along the shorelines of the Channel Islands, and what they do is they haul up on the shore, and they can scour out sites. And so the coastal environment is really dynamic, right? And so some sites are well preserved and preserved thousands of years. Other sites are single occupation. It sort of runs the gamut. You can go to one spot on one of my favorite spots on all of the islands is on Northwest San Miguel. And in one dune, there's 8,000 years of occupation recorded in middens just going right up that dune. And this is, this massive 80-foot high dune sequence. Really cool. Other spots are, I always tease John. He likes to record these really thin, what we call bird middens, because there's a few mussel shells, some abalone maybe, and a couple pieces of chip stone. And they're real archaeological sites, but they're maybe the representation of one meal that someone had and then moved on. They're John's favorite sites because then he can go and record that. It takes him about 3 minutes to do all the paperwork, and then he moves on. And then he leaves the hard stuff for me, Christina. Not sure.
I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the article that just came out and
Sure.
the coastal migration.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but from what I'm told, that it's an analysis, and they used what's called essentially dirt DNA. Call it dirt DNA. They have other more scientific names for it, but you can get information about the animals and plants that were around based on their DNA just being in the soil. So, and doing that work, coring down, I assume they did cores. And yeah, they found that those Pleistocene animals and the plants that they subsisted on didn't show up until about 12,600 years ago. And prior to that, it was more this scoured landscape that would have been really inhospitable for both animals and humans. And so it's a really powerful knock against this Clovis first migration down an ice-free corridor, and it presents a problem for even interpreting Clovis. And Clovis might be the outgrowth of people who came down the Pacific coast, moved inland, and then developed this Clovis technology, right? And then migrated up, right? And certainly other folks were migrating down the ice-free corridor, but this must have happened based on these findings later than Clovis. Later Paleo-Indian people moved down the ice-free corridor. So we'll see. I'm sure there'll be responses to that paper. And I think it's particularly interesting because David Meltzer, the lead author on that paper, was one of the authors on the paper. He was part of the Clovis Mafia, right? So he would be invested in Clovis first. He's, based on all the data, he's, the great scientist that he is, he's like, this doesn't work anymore. And so I was wrong. And we need to move on. And I feel like that's good science in action. If you're still defending your dissertation when you're about to retire, probably something's wrong.
It's easy for me to see how Clovis points were used for hunting, kind of like arrowheads. Mm-hmm. But how were the crescents used?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we get this a lot. There's been a bunch of different work, experimental work to answer that question. So folks have taken crescents, and they come in a lot of different forms, and people have argued over what they were used for and how they were used. And I still get lots of people when I show those things telling me that, that looks like what I used to cut tomatoes, right? Sliced or whatever, right? And there's been a lot of experimental work. There's also ethnographic analogy from Alaska to suggest that they were transverse projectile points. So basically, let's see if I can get to it. I was going to put a haft on one of these. probably should be pointing up here. Oh, so the shaft would have been right here, and here's the sharpened edge and the point. And they were probably used as part of an atlatl and skipped off the water into flocks of birds. So there were bird hunting points. In fact, John and another one of our colleagues, Torben Rick at the Smithsonian, have done a lot of great work at a couple sites on Santa Rosa Island near Arlington Springs that have lots of these crescents, lots of these too, but lots of crescents and faunal remains, the stuff that these people were eating and hunting, and they have a lot of bird bone. And so it seems to fit, right? It seems to fit the new data that's coming out. These were probably bird hunting technologies. So one of the reasons maybe to look at this paleoestuary, this Crescent Bay area, and these estuarine deposits were, if these people were hunting birds, they weren't doing it up here 12,500 years ago. This would have been 2 to 5 kilometers inland. They were making their technologies up here, probably because the chip stone resources were available in cobbles up here, or they were coming up on these high terraces as overlook locations to see, the resources that they were going to hunt, and then going down into the estuary using these crescents as bird hunting points. And they were probably not to kill the bird, but just to break a leg or a wing, and then you skip it off into a flock of them, wound them, and then you can go gather them up. So crescents date to on the Channel Islands, they date to anywhere between, we have them from 12.5 or so, 12.7, all the way up to about 8,000 years ago. And we also see crescents on the mainland, and it's very similar. They're found near lakes and estuarine systems, right? So on the margins of these things. And again, probably used to hunt birds. Yeah.
If anybody's interested, I give a talk about all of this experience
Yeah.
online or on the web, and I talk about crescents quite a bit and link to the flyway.
Yeah. Yeah, on the sea to shore, sort of all the talks.
Yes, part of our long series of archived lectures that you can watch at any
Yeah.
time. So we have time for one more question here.
So, with regard to the corridor down the Pacific coast, do you have any idea of what kind of width we're talking about? And secondly, the people that got out to the island on islands, and I saw Cedros Island was on there also. What kind of watercraft did they use to get out there?
So I'll answer the second part first, and the second part is we don't know. We don't know. I mean, that's a great question. I get that all the time too. It's an obvious question, right? Well, what kind of boats were they in? And we have no idea. We have no idea. I think we can make some educated guesses, and I think probably the one that most of us would agree on were some sort of skin boats, sort of akin to umiaks in Alaska, but no one's found a skin boat in the archaeological record. I mean, it just doesn't preserve. And there's been a lot of arguments in the literature about when certain types of boats and how certain types of boats were used on the Channel Islands. Thule reed boats, how long were they used? When did the tamal, that sewn plank canoe, come in? Was it early? Was it late? And there's lots of debates about that. But from my perspective, it doesn't seem that the plank canoe, right, the tamal of the Channel Islands, was a technology that was available to these earliest migrants. It wasn't invented yet. And a Thule reed boat would have not made a trans-Pacific trip. And so it must have been something different, right? And then sort of what you used on the Channel Islands then changed through time, because we don't have any ethnographic records of the Chumash using skin boats on the Channel Islands. So it's an open question. In terms of what did the corridor look like, how wide it was, Well, what we believe is they would be following fairly closely kelp forests and nearshore environments. So they're probably migrating following these kelp forests. And there's been a lot of great studies done by ecologists and other folks that have suggested that 10,000, 12, 15,000 years, kelp forests would have been even more productive and more widely distributed than they are today. And so they were probably following these kelp forests. It's a lot safer to go and travel in these kelp forests, a lot less wave action, especially if you're in a skin boat and you don't want to be in these really cold waters, right, and get flipped. But you're also following resources. The resources that they were subsisting off of were kelp forest resources and nearshore resources.
Well, let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Todd Braje. Thank you again for coming.